Good evening, everyone. My name is Artem Lanyov. I would like to present this work on the tungsten oxidation, which has been done in collaboration with a few of my colleagues here at UKA, and also with the University of Huddersfield and the University of Manchester. Studying tungsten oxidation is very important both from the fundamental point of view and from a more practical view when considering the fate of the various tungsten-containing plasma-facing materials in the future in-vessel components of a fusion reactor. And in this regard, we should mention that there are certain accidents, such as the loss of coolant accident, for example, and loss of vacuum accident, where air ingress expected in the vacuum chamber, which will lead the sensitive tungsten components to be exposed to air, which will inevitably induce oxidation because those components will still be hot and will be even getting hotter because of the decay heat processes going on after plasma shutdown. And the tungsten oxygen system is quite a complex one with many phases forming at different temperatures. And the complexity is also in the fact that the oxidation process in itself is not thermodynamic in nature, and it can combine any number of non-equilibrium stages. We have used a special set of experiments in the simultaneous thermal analyzer, which was available at UKA, to study the oxidation at changing oxygen pressure and also at changing oxidation time. We have conducted these experiments at a test temperature of about 400 degrees Celsius. This temperature was chosen for two reasons. First of all, because that's the lowest temperature relevant to the onset of LOCA, and second, because it did not require using a high vacuum system to suppress the oxidation completely. We first needed to characterize the samples before oxidation, and this was done by means of SEM and EBSD, and also with the use of confocal scanning laser microscopy. First, we analyzed the texture which the samples had developed during the manufacturing process, and well, we observed something which is typical to the Plancy material, where a pronounced texture was evident, and at most times the 001 crystallographic orientation was dominant. And also, in order to use overlaid images from the Raman machine and from the SEM machine, which were two different machines, we had to introduce three fiducial markers in the sample, which was done using nano indentation. So we basically introduced three indents and used them to orientate the images so that we could produce the exact overlaying. We started off by taking Raman spectra from the differently orientated substrate grains, and it was quite evident that for the 001 grains and for the 111 grains, the oxide produced a very different Raman spectra, which was due to the difference in the fluorescent background and due to the area of the main peak, and also because of some minor secondary features of a small region of the Raman spectra, which corresponds to the stretching vibrations. At the time of the analysis, we did not have a collection of reference Raman spectra for the different oxides, so we had to manually assemble this collection. And this was done first by looking at the data currently available in literature from different sources, and also we have filled the gap by acquiring a certain amount of test material from Sigma Aldrich, which supplied powders, for example, of the monoclinic tungsten oxide and also the monoclinic tungsten dioxide, which we analyzed using the same machine. And so we had built this small library of Raman spectra for tungsten oxides. Due to the noise observed on the spectra we've acquired, it was necessary to use certain data filtering methods. For example, we used the locally estimated scatter plot smoothing as the primary filtration method. And the filtering was actually statistically justified because the lowest parameter was chosen by applying the BIC criterion and by varying this parameter and by looking how the BIC criterion changes. So the BIC should stay as low as possible for the optimal model. And also we, of course, used the fairly standard method of asymmetric least squares to estimate the baseline and also to subtract it for future analysis. And the small portions of the Raman spectra were analyzed using the peak deconvolution technique which we developed, which had the number of peaks as a fitting parameter, which is quite unique. And we also used the BIC and AIC statistical criteria to select the optimal number of spectra, and also, of course, the position and the width of the peaks were also selected as optimal from the fitting procedure. The detailed analysis focused on the small portion of the Raman spectra from about 580 to 750 inverse centimeters. And we made an observation that for the 001 substrate orientations, there was the hexagonal tungsten trioxide growing. And for the 111 orientations, it was mostly orthorhombic oxide. Later, this changed to orthorhombic oxide for both types of orientations. Next, we used the Raman machine in the mapping mode to infer the variation of the sound filter intensity of the dominant Raman peak, and also to relate it to the previously acquired data on the orientation of the substrate grains. And it's quite obvious actually that both for the 0.1 bar and 0.2 bar, the dominant orientation is the 111, so it's the blue regions on the left figures A and D. So this corresponds to the highest sound filter intensity, which also means that this part of the sample has the thickest oxide. But when looking at extended oxidation, the Raman maps show that there is a change in this preferential character of oxidation, so that the preference shifts from the 111 pole towards the 001 pole, which is marked as 2 points corresponding to the 20-minute oxidation and also the 72 hours oxidation on the triangle to the left. So this is also in line with our statement on the possible phase transformations occurring during the oxidation. We've also analyzed the topography after oxidation with CLSM, and it was shown that the interquartile range, or the IQR, which is characteristic to this surface roughness, has a non-monotonic dependence. And the change in this dependence from decrease to increase, we actually think that it corresponds to the change in the preferential character of the oxidation, which is simply explained by the fact that certain substrate orientations gain a faster rate of oxidation as opposed to another type of the orientations, which is shown schematically in the picture to the upper right. We've been able to acquire a large number of spectra from the oxidized regions of the samples after extended oxidation. And after averaging over millions of such spectra, we were able to present a certain statistically significant sample of the Raman spectra. And it was apparent that, for example, at 20 minutes, even though there was no pronounced change in the color of the oxide, we still observed that there was a shift of the secondary peaks, which corresponded to the stretching band, to higher wave numbers. And interestingly, when increasing the oxidation time up to 72 hours, we've only seen that the main difference was the disappearance of the secondary peaks at about 900 inverse centimeters, which could correspond, for example, to the terminating tungsten oxygen bonds. And also the main peak at 809 became much more Gaussian in shape, which is interesting and led us to believe that there might be some stacking of oxides at play. The next part of our work consisted in using the pilot PSI source at the Netherlands to form a deuterium layer at the subsurface of the tungsten samples using deuterium plasma exposure, and subsequently doing oxidation of this plasma exposed surface. The samples were initially cut in 4 quadrants, which were then exposed to oxidation, and Raman spectroscopy was applied to study the Raman spectra of the central region, which featured the highest concentration of deuterium, and also the periphery. And it was quite evident that the central region featured a very pronounced peak at about 850 to 1000 inverse centimeters, which actually corresponds to the terminating double tungsten oxygen chemical bond, which is characteristic to the hydrated layer, which was suspected to form due to the deuterium exposure. We've also done some experiments at a higher temperature at about 600 degrees Celsius, and the results were even more interesting in this case because the colors that we've observed with the optical microscope on the surface of the oxidized samples were quite different, and this, we think, corresponds to the difference in the chemical composition of the oxides. So it seems that the deuterium implantation has stabilized the different oxide phases differently depending on the initial deuterium content. This is also seen from the shift of the secondary Raman peak at corresponding to the stretching vibration regions, and we've also made a map of this, which is shown on the lower right. And of course, we also see the terminating tungsten oxygen band as well. My colleague Slava Kuksenko has helped me with doing some FIB liftouts of the differently oxidized samples, and at this slide you can see that for the non-plasma exposed sample oxidized at 400 degrees Celsius for 72 hours, we have seen an oxide layer of approximately 400 nanometer thickness. So this was the sample of the Plancy tungsten origin with pancake type grains. And for the plasma exposed samples that initially had recrystallized grains, we've seen a formation of an oxide layer 480 to 520 nanometers thick at low deuterium content, which changed to 540 to 560 nanometers at high deuterium content. So there was some dependence on the deuterium content in this case. Ultimately, we have conducted a in situ TM study of the oxidation process with the Miami facility at the University of Huddersfield. These studies were conducted by my colleague Graham Greaves, Stephen Donnelly, and Jovan Lim, and I also participated in some of the studies. In this case, we had the ability to study either just the thermal oxidation or also the oxidation with simultaneous exposure to self-ion irradiation. And in both cases, we observed the formation of a nanostructure of the tungsten oxide phase, which consisted in formation of different kinds of nanorods. This process is shown on the video on this slide, where the growth of the individual tungsten oxide nanorods is shown in real time. Actually, the speed of this video has been increased threefold just for convenience. And it's actually seen that the nanorods have resemblance to the monoclinic tungsten oxide phase. So this can be either the tungsten trioxide or maybe the tungsten dioxide. It should also be noted that the electronic beam seems to disrupt the formation of this type of nanostructure. And it also seems that the growth directions are crystallography dependent. And quite interestingly, the effect of self-ions leads to the enhancement of the mass transfer process and the increased growth of the tungsten oxygen nanorods. In conclusion, I would like just to summarize what we have shown in this presentation, that first of all, the tungsten surface crystallography affects the oxidation kinetics, as we have seen by the formation of the different tungsten phases at different orientations of the substrate, and also because of the preferential character of oxidation, with some substrate orientations developing a thicker oxide than the other orientations. We've also seen that there is an evidence of phase transformation in the oxide scale occurring in real time with the oxide growth. And these phase transformations may very well be affecting the kinetics of this process, and can be responsible for the poor oxidation resistance of tungsten. We've also seen that oxidation is sensitive to surface modification by deuterium, which is evidenced by the difference in the oxide thickness observed for the low and high deuterium content regions of the plasma exposed samples. And also we've seen the oxide nanostructure formed at 700 degrees Celsius. Of course, it would be very interesting to conduct some future work on this, for example, to study the stacking of oxide phases, to conduct experiments with single crystals, and to perform additional characterization with, for example, XPS, XRD, Auger, or ILS.